Washington, D.C., November 18, 1977. In the East Building of the National Gallery of Art, craftsmen, artists, and technicians come together to assemble and install the last major work by one of America's great artists.
You can let it go a little bit.
It is the first work of art to be installed in the newly enclosed central courtyard. It is scaled precisely to complement this large area and to move with the same lightness and grace as the original model, 1/32 its size. Every step of this complex operation has been rehearsed in detail. When assembled, the 12 arms and 13 panels will span 76 feet, yet weigh little more than 900 pounds. It will ride on bearings immersed in an oil bath, allowing it to rotate, propelled by nothing more than the air currents within the courtyard.
Okay.
This day marks the successful conclusion of 6 years of effort.
You know what? The mobile is turning.
Now it has become a focal point in the East Building of the National Gallery of Art, a tribute to the man who gave life to this form of art. Alexander Calder was born into a family of artists on July 22, 1898. His grandfather, Alexander Milne Calder, came to America from Scotland and was best known for his massive statue of William Penn, one of hundreds of sculptures he created for the Philadelphia City Hall. His father, Alexander Sterling Calder, sculpting in the Beaux-Arts style, created large pieces in New York and California. Very early, Sandy became a model for his father's efforts. Although Sandy grew up with an interest in art, he turned to the study of mechanical engineering before developing his own artistic approach. In the 1920s, he traveled to France and began to gain recognition for his wire portraits and animals. In 1929, he met a young woman who would become his partner for life. Louisa James Calder, grandniece of William and Henry James, is surrounded by reminders of nearly 50 years together with Sandy, of their life in America and France, of raising their 2 daughters, Sandra and Mary. And she has not forgotten how it all began.
We met on a boat coming back from Europe, and I'd been taken to Europe by my father because he thought it'd be interesting to meet some European men. Sandy was walking on the deck and said good evening. I asked him what he did. He said he was a wire sculptor, and I couldn't imagine what a wire sculptor was. And he said he had a wire circus, and I didn't know what a wire circus was. Gradually, little by little, I got to know what his work was and what sort of a person he was. And he was gay and humorous. And then 3 or 4 years later, we were married. We had a very nice life because we both liked the same rhythm of life. And he'd get up in the morning, he'd go right out to his studio and work all day, come back in for lunch, work all afternoon, and he really loved working. And as long as he could work, have his meals, and get enough sleep, that's all he needed.
Calder invented an art form all its own. Mobiles, his friend Marcel Duchamp named them. Jean-Paul Sartre once remarked, "A mobile is a little private celebration."
Mesdames, Messieurs, je vous présente Monsieur Calder.
A performance of Calder's circus was another kind of celebration. Among his audience were fellow artists Miro, Noguchi, Mondrian, Leger, Cocteau, and Arp. Many elements of his later work were born here. Nothing escaped Calder's insatiable interest in new or different art forms. He worked with every imaginable material and in nearly every medium, viewing the world with a special sense of humor. In the early 70s, he was commissioned by a commercial airline to design the exterior of their flagship. Among his most conspicuous works are those he called staybeels. These stationary pieces can be seen complementing buildings in major cities, both here and abroad. In 1966, he created the Big Sail for a building designed by architect I.M. Pei at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In April 1972, Calder is invited to examine a large-scale model of another Pei design, the East Building of the National Gallery. A piece is needed that will work in this large open area of the central courtyard. He studies the model from every angle before enthusiastically accepting the challenge. At his studio, he sets to work in typical Calder fashion, using typical Calder tools. After considering several possibilities, Calder settles on a hanging mobile as the most appropriate solution. Steadily, the sheet aluminum and steel wire are cut, shaped, and balanced until the scale model is complete. July 2nd, 1974, near Sachet, France. Architect I.M. Pei accompanies National Gallery Director J. Carter Brown and Senior Staff Advisor David Scott to discuss with Calder how best to translate his model into a huge moving sculpture. This represents part of a large commitment by the National Gallery and Carter Brown.
From very early on, we had in mind the idea of commissioning certain grand masters of world art. And on anybody's short list of who qualifies as the greatest American sculptor of the 20th century, you would have to have Sandy Calder.
You never see the top side of that. I love it when they remove this thing right back to where it's original.
What do you call these in your jargon?
At Calder's home, there are many issues that must be resolved before the fabrication of this unique piece can begin. What materials should be used? How will the piece be assembled? How large can the mobile be and still safely clear the building's walls and bridges? Will it rotate without being motorized? There is much at stake, and the importance of these decisions is apparent to the gallery, to the artist, and to architect Pei.
When I first thought of commissioning a work of art for a building that I designed, I could only come upon really a handful of names, and his was one of them, because it is a problem of trying to find a suitable piece of art for a building. It's more difficult for the artist than it is for the architects, because we come first. But as soon as we look at that space, Calder's the only artist that came to mind.
Are we going to have stiffeners on these vertical members?
So you want it different,
If it's the same one, it would disappear.
When he first came up with the model of a mobile, I was a little disappointed. But then as I began to study the mobile in the model, I began to recognize that we were onto something extraordinary, that there was a marriage between that space and that work of art, which was everything we'd ever dreamed about. It had all of that quality of chance that his works of art do, the homemade aspect, which is part of the delight.
The red one does go under the marble wall, doesn't it?
Quick way to do it, but the other way, here.
You can't help loving the man. He just had this wonderful, great bear quality. And it's very hard to understand. You had to listen very carefully sometimes to figure out what it was he was saying, but it usually was right on the money.
Well, this probably is better for the cracking a whip, as I call it.
Yeah.
Let's get all these terms out.
Sandy and I wrote back and forth there in April about all the things we could do on this, and I felt a little like God redesigning Calders, but...
We're on good on it.
The laughter is short-lived, for when they arrive at the Biemo foundry and tour to discuss enlarging the mobile, they discover that the components have already been made, too large, too heavy, and too soon. The projected weight for Biemo's enlargement approaches 3 tons. As they study the intermediate model, a basic difference in Biemo's approach becomes apparent. They had been very successful helping Calder create extraordinary outdoor stabiles and mobile stabile combinations by making them heavy and rugged enough to withstand the forces of nature. However, their working model indicates that this approach would yield disastrous results when enlarged full size.
In the same alignment and see where we got off the track. We got a problem here. We saw these pieces and our hearts sank to see the joints engineered in such a way that they could have turned only in certain directions, to see the pipes that were to magnify that delicate wire being translated into pieces of pipe with 6-inch stiffeners sticking up above them, so that in silhouette they would have seemed even heavier still. So that what you ended up with was sure to be, in our mind, a stabile rather than a mobile.
Out of scale. So since there are more pipe here, it stacks down. You can't bend it back. You cannot bend it back.
Beamon had done many mobile and stabile, but I was terribly disappointed. It looked so unlike his model. In fact, it looked so heavy that it almost looked like it can support the building.
Because they didn't do it right for you. They didn't do it right. Of course, this is not in proportion, is it? It doesn't have the delicacy that your maquette has, which is so, something heavy about this proportionately. May not be important, but it's something to be concerned about.
It is heavy, that's it.
Yeah, it's not in scale. Yeah. Okay, let's go back.
Calder had great faith in what he called the artisanat, the sense of integrity of the artisan working with his hands. And he liked the clunky quality in his outdoor stabiles that he had achieved with hard-working and talented personnel. And what we were after was another aspect of Calder's work, which was his lightness and whimsy and fantasy and imagination.
To achieve this goal, the traditional techniques and materials that had worked in the past would now have to be abandoned. As the afternoon wears on, it becomes clear to everyone in the room that there will be no easy solutions.
It's too bad.
I think the thing to do, David, is to take his working drawings back and get the scale modified according to a database that is mutual.
I felt that we needed a new factor in the equation, and it was really luck that I happened to know someone who I thought was uniquely qualified to solve this one for us. Paul Matisse had known Calder as a boy. Furthermore, Paul combined the qualities of artist and engineer to an extraordinary degree.
The basic idea was simply to use the lightest possible materials for the planes and to make all the arms out of the highest strength material I could get and the lightest material. And I made a quick sketch to indicate how I would do it. And so I went over to see Sandy and showed him the sketch. And he looked at everything and then asked me if I wanted to play billiards. We went downstairs and had a couple of hours not talking about anything. And Sandy, at one point, just said, "Can you make it for me?" I said, "Sure." And it was a nice moment to remember because it was so simple and straightforward. So back here, I had to discover whether or not my quick sketches really could be borne out in reality. And the first thing I did was to measure the piece. I wanted the same relationships of size because what interested me about his pieces was that there was a harmony which was established not so much by Sandy as by nature. Sandy starts out and makes two pieces that will balance. Then he goes from that part to the next part and makes another section that will balance the first. And as he's doing that, he's going to be cutting the different pieces with his snippers and his big file, thinking just differently about each one, and you get this crazy relationship between them that is just right because it's Sandy. So in his mobiles, you have a harmony that's established by the laws of balance, and you have Sandy's wild spirit that establishes the shape. And I love that combination, and I didn't want to mess with any of it. I didn't want to change it.
Beginning in March 1975, Paul Matisse sets to work developing a meticulously calculated and balanced design. He tests and retests all available materials before finally assembling a plan that will most faithfully replicate the original. In November, Calder meets with Matisse at the National Gallery to discuss a wide range of details.
What color you want? You see, in Sandy's model, the original one, which I have right there, there's no color on the arms, but the arms are going to be out of aluminum. And so this is the natural color that they would become.
They won't be stainless steel?
They won't be stainless steel. Stainless steel is 3 times as heavy as aluminum.
Well, from here down, it might be red and the rest red.
When I would go to visit him to check out various details, I was always far more serious than Sandy was. I haven't touched it except to take care of it. I guess he really had faith in the fact that whatever he did was going to be all right. He would sort of say, well, what's this epoxy stuff? You know, he didn't know what epoxy was. So he had to have faith. But his approach to it was that you go ahead and make it and I'll come and see it when it's done. This part is welded and then heat treated. This part is heat treated, and they're joined together by a very strong steel bars inside. The arms that have a lot of stress in them are thick wall inside, and the arms down here that have less stress are thin wall tubing, and this arm is even thinner than that.
Yeah,
Oh boy! You have to bring it to a zero temper, bend it, and you have to weld it because you can't make a 360-degree loop.
Now, how much deflection will it have? Some of that nice curve? Because
Well,
that's what's so
Carter,
great here is that it bows slightly. You get that wonderful sense of it.
My intention, Carter, is to make it
Just like that.
just like that.
Okay.
Yeah. This can be shifted simply by making this arm a little longer. The whole thing was fun and games, how to resolve all these little details in as free and as correct a manner as possible.
If you raise it, what will prevent this one from running into this one? By raising this one. Boy, you can always make this little flatter more. Well,
Too late for that. Well, we can start again, but as it is, it's going to be marvelous. And so I had to reverse bend the blade arm just a little bit to pick it up.
Now the
But even at that
fabrication
point,
process begins in earnest.
Here and there to get it. It worked fine.
Nothing is
But
overlooked.
these little details,
The
getting
slightest variation is
down,
considered and entered into
exactly
Paul
right.
Matisse's complex plan.
Here were these, the finals. I measured every bar.
The curve of each fin and blade is reproduced by hand on a template to capture every minute change of angle. Made of structural aluminum honeycomb, the panels are strong, yet light enough to respond to the circulation of air. Matisse had contracted with the most talented and experienced fabricators available, but since nothing like this had ever been attempted, he must personally oversee every phase of construction. The arms, made of aircraft aluminum alloy, are spliced together using bars bonded with high-strength epoxy. The deflection of each arm and balance of each panel is tested over and over. Matisse is determined that when the full-sized mobile is completed, it will look just like that.
The problem with the job was that there was no practice run. There was only going to be one of them. And I've never done anything where I couldn't do the second one better than the first. I asked Sandy and the National Gallery to come up because the whole thing was, in a sense, a risk.
We walked into the space, which was the largest one that Paul Matisse could find to rent. It still wasn't big enough to hang the entire Calder in the way it eventually would go. But it was a way of checking on how it might move in the air currents. Some of us even were able to move them by blowing on them. And to think of the size of that piece of machinery, this was an extraordinary feat.
I showed him the honeycomb and joint bars and all the rest. And when we asked Sandy whether they should look the way they looked or whether they should be square-edged, he said that that's the way that he would make it, the way it looks now.
Sandy, I think, felt that this was really going to work, and he seemed to have tremendous confidence in Paul, and he felt that it was all going to come out okay.
Sandy cracked a few jokes, left his impression, so to speak, and he was very pleased about the piece, and I was pleased that he was pleased.
8 days later, following a visit to Washington, D.C., Alexander Calder died. Today, in the East Building of the National Gallery of Art, the final work of an important American artist can be enjoyed and appreciated by all who come here. Some may feel his humor, others his sense of scale or strength. But for everyone, it is a highly personal experience.
I just smile when I see it, especially this cascade of blades, ending up with that little tiny red one, which is always sort of poking around into various places. And architecturally, that space is so defined. You just feel that every angle, every plane has been set in just precisely the right place. Now, here's Sandy's piece right in the midst of that, saying, basically, it doesn't matter which way I am, I'm fine anyway. And it has a timeless value that no technology will ever change or put in the shade, so to speak.
You go in the building and you watch it play against those forms, and you recognize, in many ways, the Calder has everything. Its grace, the brightness of its color, the way it fascinates by movement, and yet is so sophisticated in the way it relates to itself and to the building, all add up to an enormously satisfying experience.
I think Calder has done as well as any. I think this piece, in fact, does more for the space than any other piece I know. Because the building is static. It's the people's movement that animates the building. Now, this piece of sculpture contributes to that. Now I can't imagine this space without it.